Right, so while most people spent their weekend meal prepping or doom scrolling through Netflix, the Labor Party decided to have another spectacular meltdown, and this time it's over Venezuela. Yes, Venezuela, because apparently internal party unity is so last decade, and what better way to kick off 2026 than with a good old-fashioned civil war over a U.S. military operation thousands of miles away. Keir Starmer is being called weak and pathetic by his own MPs, and honestly, the drama is so thick you could spread it on toast. So here's what happened. Donald Trump, fresh off his inauguration and clearly feeling quite frisky, decided to launch what can only be described as a Hollywood action movie come to life. Elite U.S. Special Forces, backed by over 150 aircraft, stormed Nicolás Maduro's compound in Caracas in a dawn raid that makes the bin Laden operation look like a gentle wake-up call. They grabbed Maduro and his wife straight out of bed, bundled them onto helicopters, and shipped them off to America faster than you can say regime change. The whole thing took hours. Venezuela's air defenses were about as effective as a chocolate teapot. Now, you'd think labor might have a unified response to this, right? Maybe something diplomatic, something carefully worded that doesn't immediately spark internal warfare. But no, that would be far too sensible. Instead, what we got was Keir Starmer saying Britain sheds no tears about the end of Maduro's regime, which, fair enough, considering the man's track record makes your average Bond villain look like a charity worker. But that comment has gone down with the Labour left about as well as a bacon sandwich at a vegan festival. Enter Richard Burgon, the Leeds East MP and professional thorn in Starmer's side. Speaking at an online rally that sounds like it was organized in someone's living room, Burgon absolutely lost it. He accused Starmer of giving Trump the green light for what he called an illegal bombing and kidnapping. Now, let's pause here for a second. Burgon's argument is essentially that Starmer should have responded to Trump's action the same way he would have if Putin had done it, which is an interesting take, considering we're comparing the removal of a documented human rights abuser with hypothetical Russian aggression. It's like comparing apples with hand grenades. But Burgon wasn't done. Oh no, he went full throttle, accusing Trump of naked colonialism and claiming the operation was designed to install far-right governments across Latin America. He actually said Trump wants to turn Latin America into nothing more than a U.S. colony, because apparently removing one socialist dictator is the same as annexing an entire continent. The logic here is doing backflips. And it gets better. John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn's former right-hand man and someone who clearly wakes up every morning asking himself how he can make Starmer's day worse, jumped in with his own spicy take. He claims Starmer has turned Britain into a Trump colony. A Trump colony, because expressing relief that a torturing dictator got arrested is apparently the same as pledging eternal allegiance to Mar-a-Lago. Now, this online rally where all this kicked off was hosted by union activist Louise Regan, and organizers claimed about 1,000 people tuned in. They spent the evening insisting that Venezuelans have the right to choose their own leaders, which sounds lovely and democratic until you remember that Maduro has been rigging elections for over a decade. The irony is so thick you'd need a chainsaw to cut through it. These activists are crying about sovereignty and international law while conveniently forgetting that Maduro's idea of democracy involved armed government thugs standing outside polling stations making sure people voted the right way. In 2024, independent monitors documented systematic fraud so obvious it made your uncle's card tricks look sophisticated. The Carter Center, which monitors elections globally and isn't exactly known for hyperbole, said the fraud effectively disenfranchised most of the migrant population. But sure, let's pretend this was a functioning democracy. And let's talk about what Maduro's regime actually did, shall we? Because the Labor left seems remarkably quiet about the details. His so-called Special Action Forces, which is a very fancy name for death squads, murdered at least 5,287 people in 2018 alone. That's not a typo. 5,287 people. By mid-May 2019, another 1,569 had been killed. These weren't accidents. These weren't collateral damage. These were deliberate extrajudicial killings carried out by government forces. The U.S. Department of State, not exactly known for being soft on anyone, branded Maduro a dictator, guilty of gross violations of human rights, including systemic repression, torture, and intimidation. The UN launched an investigation that uncovered allegations of actual torture chambers. Amnesty International documented cases of children being tortured. Children. Let that sink in for a moment. And yet, here we have Labor MPs clutching their pearls because Trump decided to do something about it. The cognitive dissonance is genuinely astounding. These are the same people who will rightfully condemn Putin for his actions in Ukraine, who will demand international law be upheld when it suits their narrative, but when it comes to a socialist dictator with a body count that would make a medieval tyrant blush, suddenly it's all about sovereignty and anti-imperialism. It's almost impressive how selective the outrage is. And this is where Starmer finds himself, stuck between a rock and a very angry hard place. On one side, you've got basic human decency suggesting that maybe we shouldn't mourn the fall of someone who ran torture chambers. On the other side, you've got a chunk of your own party treating you like you've personally enlisted in the U.S. Marines because you didn't immediately condemn the operation. The word weak keeps getting thrown around, which is fascinating because you'd think standing up and saying we're not going to pretend a torturing dictator deserves sympathy would be considered quite strong. But apparently, in certain corners of the Labor Party, strength means defending authoritarian regimes as long as they've got the right ideological flavor. It's political tribalism at its absolute finest. What's particularly wild about this whole situation is the timing. Labor is supposed to be governing. They've got actual domestic issues to deal with. The NHS isn't going to fix itself. The cost of living crisis hasn't magically vanished. But instead of focusing on that, we're having a full-blown ideological battle over a U.S. military operation in Venezuela. It's like watching someone argue about the color of deck chairs while the Titanic is actively sinking. And let's be honest about what this really reveals. The Labor Party is still fundamentally divided on basic questions of foreign policy and values. You can wrap it up in fancy language about international law and colonialism all you want, but at its core, this is about whether you think Western intervention is always wrong regardless of context. Burgon and McDonnell clearly believe it is. They've decided that Trump doing it automatically makes it illegitimate, facts be damned. But here's the thing that really gets me. These MPs will happily invoke international law when it suits them, but international law isn't a buffet where you pick and choose the bits you like. Maduro systematically violated his own people's human rights for years. He rigged elections, ran death squads, and created conditions so terrible that millions of Venezuelans fled the country. At what point does the international community's responsibility to protect come into play? Or does that only count when it's not a socialist doing the oppressing? The response from these labor rebels completely ignores what actual Venezuelans think. You know, the people who've been living under Maduro's boot for years, the millions who fled to escape his regime, the families of the 5,287 people murdered by his death squads. Something tells me they're not joining online rallies to defend his right to stay in power. But apparently their voices don't count as much as British MPs who've decided from thousands of miles away that this is imperialism. Trump's operation was audacious, there's no denying that. Personally, overseeing it from Mar-a-Lago is very on brand for him. The whole thing does feel like something out of a Tom Clancy novel, but audacious doesn't automatically mean wrong. Sometimes the bold move is the right move, especially when you're dealing with someone who's been thumbing his nose at the international community for years while torturing his own people. And yes, we can have legitimate debates about intervention, sovereignty, and international law. Those are important conversations, but those conversations require acknowledging reality, not creating an alternate version where Maduro was some misunderstood socialist hero being persecuted by the evil West. The man ran torture chambers. He rigged elections. He murdered thousands. These aren't disputed facts. These are documented, verified atrocities. So where does this leave Starmer? Well, in the short term, it leaves him facing yet another rebellion from his left flank. The Socialist Campaign Group is never going to be happy with him. They weren't happy when he was elected leader, they weren't happy during the election campaign, and they're certainly not happy now. This is just the latest excuse for them to air their grievances publicly and make governing that bit harder. But in the longer term, this might actually help Starmer. The British public, contrary to what some MPs seem to think, aren't particularly sympathetic to dictators. Most people hear torture chambers and death squads and think, yeah, probably not the good guys. If the Labor left wants to die on the hill of defending Maduro's right to continue running Venezuela into the ground, that's their choice, but it's not exactly going to win hearts and minds in the swing seats Labor needs to keep. The irony is that Starmer's statement was actually quite measured. He didn't endorse the operation enthusiastically. He didn't pledge Britain's military support. He simply said, "We're not crying about the end of this regime," which seems like a fairly reasonable position. But reasonable doesn't cut it anymore. You're either with the hard left's worldview completely, or you're a traitor to the cause. There's no middle ground. This whole episode is a perfect encapsulation of modern Labor's identity crisis. Are they a serious party of government that has to deal with complex international realities, or are they an activist movement that judges everything through a rigid ideological lens regardless of context? Because you can't really be both. Governing requires pragmatism, compromise, and sometimes accepting that the world isn't as simple as your university politics seminar suggested. And what's particularly frustrating about this whole situation is that there are legitimate questions to ask about the operation. What happens next in Venezuela? Who's going to govern? What's the plan for stability? These are serious policy questions that deserve serious debate. But instead, we're getting performances